Now the buzz about the GH4 is that it has internal 4K recording. Granted, it's a mirrorless system, but for $1,700, such a compact solution for videographers, there has never been as much noise for a camera, I think, since the 5D Mark II. It is packed with features, all the bells and whistles you can think of. 12 frames per second, it has a 16 megapixel sensor, it has built-in Wi-Fi, which I'm using to record this video right now. It has built-in HDR, tracking. The flippy touchscreen monitor is awesome, makes it super fun and super easy to use. It is a wonderful camera. I've had it for several months now and I love it. Now, when you look at the strategy that Sony's doing, they're really leading the charge for full-frame mirrorless cameras. With the A7S, they did something counterintuitive, and that is, instead of cramming more pixels into a tighter space, they went with fewer pixels because they know they can make the photo sites larger. We'll be talking about that in a second. So 12 megapixels on a full-frame sensor at a price point of $2,500. This is a very interesting camera, especially if you are a wedding or a portrait photographer. Now the A7S also features a tremendous variety of camera settings for shooting video. I've shot with it at 1080, it's awesome, and I have also shot extensively with this camera at 4K. Now I went through a lot of trouble to figure out how to get 4K video out of the Sony, which requires an external recorder. Most of us are waiting for the Atomos Shogun to come out in September, but with this workaround that was sponsored by B&H Photo, we are going to see some 4K video going head-to-head against the GH4. Now there are a lot of people out there that may think that a micro four thirds sensor competing with a full-frame sensor is not a fair fight. And this is a very valid point when we're considering the topic of equivalence. I'm going to put a link to an excellent article on DP Review that explains it better than anywhere I've ever seen. But suffice it to say that equivalence is when you are using different format cameras to produce similar images in all aspects, including your field of view, your depth of field, your ISO performance. They're very, very different when they are going head-to-head against each other. Suffice it to say that if you use a 12 to 35 millimeter lens on a micro four thirds camera, that is going to behave pretty much like a 24 to 70 lens on a full frame in terms of focal length. Now, if that lens is 2.8 on the micro four thirds, the depth of field is going to be the equivalent of 5.6. So there's a lot of very technical and important differences between the two cameras, and we have to keep this in mind when we're comparing the images. Now, another very important aspect of each of these cameras is how many pixels they're cramming into how tight of a space, pixel density. Pixels probably aren't the best word to describe it. I think photosite is a better word, or sensile I've heard. Pixel is what we see in a final image. It's what's in the pictures. When we're talking about the sensor and the elements that produce pixels, those are a little bit different. Now the A7S has a gapless full-frame sensor, which means it has plenty of space for its 12 million pixels. When we actually sit down and do the math, the A7S has a photo site size, one edge of it measures 8.4 micrometers. When we compare this with the GH4, it's about 3.7, and if you calculate the surface area of these photo sites, you're looking at about 5 times more surface area on the A7S. Very important to remember when we're talking about things like color accuracy and things like noise performance. The larger the photo sites, the more accurate the colors and the less noise you're going to have. In many ways, the A7S has a very distinct advantage. My epic shootouts are intended to be educational and informative. I'm trying to provide you the best information you can get in order to make a great purchase depending on what kind of photographer you are. I like to test the core features of both cameras. There's a lot of little settings and things that we can play with. I try to stick with the core basics. Another thing that I like to do is have tests where you can actually see the results and we can measure in numbers the results. These tests should also be able to be repeated by literally anybody who does them in the same conditions. Very important for me to stay unbiased. I own both systems. I've invested a tremendous amount of money into the lenses of both systems. I have no affiliation with either company, and it's very important to me that you guys know this. I'm not showing favoritism. I'm simply giving you advice based on these test results. Now, if you're a brand new photographer to either camera and you're struggling to learn it, you're definitely going to want to check out my crash course video for either the GH4 or the A7S. I'll teach you the basics and help you to shoot like a pro in no time. If you're an advanced shooter, you're probably going to want to check out my new Maven adapter. It's my first photography accessory. It's going to allow you to attach your camera to the end of a hardware pole to get very simple aerial shots without needing a drone. I'm going to have a link in the description. It's going to be on sale for all of my Epic Shootout viewers and new subscribers for a limited time only. The 3 servo sports tests I wanted to perform were: number 1, a side-to-side moving subject with the sun behind the shooter; number 2, a fast-moving forward subject with the sun to the shooter's back; number 3, a subject moving away from the shooter into heavy backlight. The plan was to shoot on the fastest burst speed that has continuous autofocus. On the GH4, this is 7 frames per second. On the A7S, it's listed at 2.5, but I believe it's closer to 2. You'll be able to hear it when we do the burst tests. I'll compose my subject on the far right or far left of the monitor, shoot on JPEG, count the out-of-focus shots, and determine an accuracy percentage based on the total number of shots taken. One of the fundamental differences between using a mirrorless camera versus a DSLR for sports shooting is that so far what I've seen on both the GH4 and the A7S is that if you were to rack your zoom ring during a burst mode, most of the shots are going to miss focus. Now on a DSLR camera, we're able to rack our zoom ring during a burst mode because light's coming through the lens, it's hitting the mirror, going down onto a focusing array, and it can measure and predict our subject moving in real time. That's the biggest difference I'm seeing between DSLRs and mirrorless systems. It's just a matter of time before the mirrorless systems, maybe through a software update or what hardware update maybe, will become much better at sports focusing. They've come a long way, but they're not quite there yet. For side-to-side action, both cameras scored very well, with the GH4 getting 77% and the A7S 68%. This is not surprising because the focal plane doesn't change much for this type of motion. Nearly all of the out-of-focus shots in this test came when our model was starting or stopping. In forward-moving action with the sun behind the shooter, the GH4 scored 82% and the A7S scored a 59%. In action moving away from the camera into strong backlight is where we start to see the biggest differences, with the GH4 scoring 76% and the A7S 39%. This is significant, and upon further testing, I noticed that sometimes the A7S struggles when focusing into very heavy backlight. One of the problems we had to keep in mind was the issue of equivalence, which means that if we're shooting at 2.8 on the GH4, we needed to shoot at 5.6 on the A7S in order to maintain similar depths of field. This also means that these results are not comparable to my other DSLR shootouts. We conducted dozens of different tests on 4 different days with over 4,000 images taken and used the data from what we believed were the most comparable and fair tests, and we averaged them to determine these percentages. A camera's buffer performance is how long it can write to the memory card before it starts to slow down its frames per second. Now on both cameras, we are going to be shooting on the continuous focus mode, which is 7 frames per second on the GH4. It's really about 1.5 to 2 frames per second on the A7S. We're using the Transcend 64GB Class U3 card in both cameras, and we're just going to let the buffer fill up. Ready, go? So you can start to hear it slowing down after about 40 to 50 shots. That's with both RAW and JPEG. Now, if you're doing JPEG only, it's closer to 100 or 130 frames before it starts to slow down. Now let's listen to the A7S. So you can hear that the A7S continues its frames per second, but in all honesty, at 1.5 to 2 frames per second, it's not that impressive. The GH4 can keep up at about 1 frame per second once it fills up too. So buffer performance, I'm more impressed with the GH4. For sports shooting, which includes a measure of total frames per second with continuous focusing, accuracy in those modes, buffer performance, and the ease of focus square selection, the GH4 would be the one that I would personally choose for shooting a sporting event. The A7S can take great action shots. It has better depth of field when shooting wide open, beautiful colors coming straight out of the camera. Just know that your hands are going to be a little bit tied when you're concerned about maximum frames per second, as well as the accuracy of those shots. Another test I like to perform are the camera's abilities to focus in low light. Both are rated to focus down to -4 exposure values, and I prefer to do the test without the focused assist lamp turned on. My methodology is outlined on my blog, but suffice it to say I have 2 targets at different distances and different brightnesses, and then I focus back and forth for 30 repetitions, timing how long it takes each camera to achieve 30 focus locks. If one camera consistently struggles to focus more than another, it will take much longer, and this is something we can easily see in the time differences. Typically, I like to set one target at 6.5 exposure values, and the second target 10 to 15 feet away at -5 exposure values. Both cameras were super fast to focus in these conditions with identical averages of 43 seconds. In order to shoot in darker conditions, I had to estimate the exposure value beyond -2 EV, which is the limit for my light meter, and I did so using my camera. Between -2 EV and -3 EV, the A7S scored an average of 47 seconds, with the GH4 scoring an average of 76 seconds. I repeated the test at -2 to -3.7 EV, and the A7S scored 90 seconds with the GH4 at 105 seconds. This is astonishing performance for both cameras. It is seriously spectacular, and I have never tested any other DSLR that can focus in the range of these 2 cameras. One thing that I did notice in my tests was that if the target was very, very close to a bright light source, like a very bright light source, the A7S would struggle more to get focus lock. Between this and the sports focusing results, I believe the GH4 has the edge when focusing into backlight. It's also beyond capable for low light focusing. The A7S just does it a little bit faster. Our winner here is the Sony A7S with the GH4 close on its heels. In our JPEG noise chart test, we included standard noise reduction on for both systems. At lower ISOs, both cameras look pretty good to me, but once we get to an ISO of about 1600, we start to see visible grain in the green and gray swatch for the camera on the right. At an ISO of 3200, it really starts to struggle. The camera on the left, however, continues to show excellent performance through 6400 and even higher. I also performed a number of ISO tests when shooting on 4K video for both cameras. A lot of this is going to come down to personal preference and subject matter and how much grain is acceptable to you. I personally am feeling uncomfortable with the grain at 1600 on the GH4, whereas I can shoot with 3200, 6400 on the A7S and feel pretty good about it. This may change from person to person, but I think we can all agree that the noise performance on the A7S is much better once we get into these higher ISOs. I wanted to repeat the ISO video performance test in very mixed lighting conditions with a human subject. We had both fluorescent and incandescent lights, as well as dozens of candles. We then dialed in the same exact exposure settings, equivalent focal length lenses, and the same exact Kelvin white balance of 4500. Something you will notice immediately is that even with the same settings, the footage looks very different. The GH4 looks a little underexposed and more yellowish. Now, I know a lot of people aren't going to like this test, and I am not suggesting the GH4's colors can't be dialed in, because they can, and they can also be corrected in post. What this test does suggest to me, however, is that the A7S is more forgiving and more accurate in very mixed lighting conditions, and this is to be expected with its massively large photo sites. In terms of ISO performance, I'll let you judge for yourself. I like the 1600 range on the GH4, but the ISO performance again on the A7S is simply spectacular, even well past 12,800 and higher. Subject matter and preference really make a difference, but I'll leave that up to you. For color sampling accuracy in mixed lighting conditions and overall video ISO performance, the win here goes to the Sony. Banding is a horizontal line artifact that appears in raw images when the exposure is increased in post 2 or 3 stops. The GH4 shows great performance of up to 2 stops when shooting at an ISO of 3200. The A7S shows incredible performance from 3200 to 25,600. I would describe it more of a diffuse pattern than actual banding, which we start to see at an ISO over 100,000. For the raw banding test, the A7S has at least a 3 to 4 or even more stop advantage over the GH4 and is easily the winner here. Moiré is a splotchy artifact that sometimes shows up on recorded video. I have an excellent line shirt that is wonderful at detecting a camera's moiré performance. In a very interesting 4K comparison, the camera on the left shows strong moiré, while the camera on the right shows a minimal amount. Out of curiosity, I also shot the shirt at lower resolutions with the camera on the left showing much less moiré and the camera on the right showing much more. The take-home message here is that the GH4 shows minimal moiré when shooting at 4K and more so when recording at 1080. It would make more sense to shoot at 4K and then downres in post if you are using the GH4. The Sony is showing more moiré at 4K when compared to its 1080 recording format. If your end goal is 1080 footage with minimal moiré and you're using the Sony, it would make more sense to shoot at that resolution. Because the GH4 has minimal moiré at 4K which can then be downconverted, it is the winner in our 4K moiré challenge. Another video artifact we see is rolling shutter, which is noticeable when a camera is panned back and forth and has also been described as the jello effect. You see it as this kind of slushy movement back and forth. The A7S at 4K shows noticeable rolling shutter. The GH4 also shows rolling shutter, but in my opinion it's just a little bit better. For minimal rolling shutter performance, the win goes to the GH4. The A7S has an S-Log feature, which suffice it to say will allow you to capture much more detail and otherwise blown out highlights. Compare the lamps in each of these two clips, one without S-Log, the other with, and you will see how phenomenal this feature is. Now, one drawback here is that it requires an ISO of 3200 and you're not going to be able to use it in bright daylight without very strong ND filters. But this is an absolutely awesome feature for videographers who want to capture the details and highlights. I know many people are interested in the 10-bit 4K video coming out of the GH4. I have some mixed feelings about it and I can tell you why. Once we got into higher ISOs, really anything over 800 and especially over 1600, we start to see visible noise in what I am calling the crayon effect, which appears to be compression of this high ISO noise. I think at lower ISOs, it looks wonderful. But at higher ISOs, the footage becomes unusable. Take a look at Jen's gown in this example. Her gown is supposed to be sheer, as in mostly see-through. Here it looks like a black robe. And when we look at it on the Sony, in a similar exposed shot, the sampling, again, is better. We can see right through it. My take-home message on the 10-bit is this. It's cool, but it may not be worth it at higher ISOs. We were only able to get it to work correctly with the YAGH base, which is another $2,000, and this also greatly limits your mobility, which is the strength of the GH4 when shooting 4K. My recommendations here is that I think high quality glass would be a better investment, but at least rent the gear you need to get 10-bit before you go out and buy a recorder. An external recorder like the Shogun coming out in September makes a lot more sense for the A7S than it does for the GH4. Each camera has a high-speed frame rate, which can then be played back in slow motion. I had my good friend Brandon shoot some arrows into a target about 60 feet away. At normal speed, the arrows move so fast, it is nearly impossible to see them. The A7S is capable of recording at 120 frames per second at 720, and this includes sound, which is super cool. The GH4 can record 96 frames per second at 1080, but this is without sound and also without autofocus. You can upres these files for 4K. Just know the quality is going to suffer when you do this. What I want you to do now is to get a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, and I'm going to show you sets of images side by side done in similar shooting conditions, and I want you to write down your initial impression in terms of which one that you like more. Now, it should be your initial response, and I'm going to tell you something that may shock you. I intentionally changed the aperture and the depth of field in both of these cameras to mix it up. Again, when I was shooting with the Micro Four Thirds, I could see it pretty quick in terms of the difference. So I got some Voigtlander lenses, 0.95 aperture, very, very wide. They introduce tremendously shallow depths of field. And I think this proves, I could be wrong, that you can make a Micro Four Thirds sensor look like a full frame sensor if you have better glass. Now for the GH4 owners, this is a very important tip. Wider aperture lenses are going to give you much more performance out of your camera, both in terms of your maximum acceptable ISO. Okay, you're going to be able to get a lot more light coming into the camera, and it is also going to allow you to get these very shallow depths of field. So by now you've gone through the portrait test, and I want you to check your answers. Here they are. Write down whether it was the GH4 or the A7S, and you'll know whether or not the GH4 is capable of producing acceptable quality images when we compare it to a full frame sensor. Hey Nick, how you doing, man? Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Mike.
For those of you that don't know, Nick is the president of PAC, P-A-C, and that stands for?
Stands for the Photographers Adventure Club.
And they're essentially a giant club where they have workshops with models. You guys went and shot an Antelope Canyon recently.
Yep, Antelope Canyon, Havasupai, all over. Horseshoe Bend, Grand Canyon. We go all over the state and outside the state.
So there's chapters all over the country, pretty much.
35 chapters with over 25,000 members.
That's incredible. And so people can join pretty much PAC all over the country. How would they find out about that?
You just go to the website. It's photoadvclub.com and look for your state. And if there's not a chapter, then you can make one.
And there's also free memberships. So you guys...
Yep, starts at free, and then we have a $49 and a $199.
So for those of you who are looking for great hands-on practice in networking with other photographers of varying ranges, there's really nothing better that you can do than get involved with a photography club. PAC is one of the best organized ones that I've run across here in Arizona. So I brought two cameras. Nick and I have been talking about the mirrorless, different mirrorless systems for a while, and he's wanted to get his hands on some. So we're going to go shoot some landscape stuff here, and I can't wait to see what you think about it.
It's going to be awesome. I think we're going to have a great time.
You ready to rock and roll?
Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. Nick and I shot various landscape shots, and I learned some interesting things. Number one, both cameras are great for landscape work. Number two, it seems to me that if you're going for deeper depths of field, the GH4 can do so with wider equivalent f-stops. You don't need f8. f4 will get you there. This can be an advantage of that deeper depth of field with the GH4. While we were shooting, a lightning storm started in the distance. I later realized it's super easy to grab still shots off 4K video, which means if you like to capture lightning, you can do so without the need for any special lightning triggers. Between my test shooting with Nick, I decided to visit the Phoenix Zoo to see what types of interesting animal shots I could get, as well as see what we could learn about the dynamic range of both cameras. My expectation initially was that the A7S would destroy the GH4 in terms of dynamic range, but when I looked at the images on my computer, the GH4 really stood its ground in most cases, even when shooting in very bright light with darker shadows, and it proved it time and again. Accurately measuring the dynamic range of a camera is not as simple as it may sound. The accuracy of light sampling is also very different in both cameras. You can dial in the same exact exposure settings, and sometimes it's not going to give you the same look. So there is a lot more to it than just adjusting a slider and recovering some highlights in camera raw. Here are some things I am comfortable saying. Number one, the monitor on the GH4 does not accurately represent what is coming out of the camera, and I think this is why a lot of people disregard it when they initially start shooting with it. The images are much better on a full monitor. Number two, with the S-Log feature turned on, the dynamic range on the A7S is astonishing. This was easily visible in the lamp tests that we already saw. The GH4 can also be tweaked to get much more dynamic range out of it than the default settings. The problem with this is it introduces a lot of variables for both systems, and it would be very difficult for me to keep it fair without, one camera getting a little bit better tweaking than the other, so I just didn't open that can of worms. Number three, your dynamic range won't matter as much when the image becomes unusable due to noise, and this goes for both cameras. The GH4 hits its noise wall first, with the A7S performing better at higher ISOs. Number four, at lower ISOs, from what I've seen in my images as well as my test shots, the GH4 holds its ground very well. In fact, I believe the dynamic range of these cameras at lower ISOs is actually very similar. My conclusion on this is that for a micro four thirds camera, the GH4 does an amazing job at lower ISOs. Remember, it only has 1/5 of the real estate when we're talking about the photo sites. The A7S, again, is going to be much better when using higher ISOs. So Nick, you've had 2 days to shoot with each of the cameras. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, right out of the box, this GH4 was comfortable in my hand. Menu systems were dead on, and the actual touchscreen is awesome. You could just play around with it, hit your focus, and you nail it.
What do you like about the Sony?
Sony, I really like the actual focusing system on it. It focused really dead on. The depth of field was actually really nice, and my contrast from my sky was a lot more than what the GH4 had.
ISO performance, which one was better?
Oh, this was just...
Definitely?
Yeah.
As far as somebody who's brand new to the systems, if you're a brand new beginner, which camera was easier to learn, would you say?
I would say, out of the box right here, the Lumix.
The GH4?
Excellent.
Nick, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and I hope to see you again.
See you soon.
All right. Operational efficiencies is essentially how fast it takes you to change a camera setting and get to shooting. The flippy touchscreen monitor on the GH4 makes general operation very fast and easy to use. The dedicated focus mode button, the ability to change focus on the touchscreen was lightning quick. The A7S has a tilt-only screen, which is nice. I actually like the monitor quality more on the A7S, but having to navigate the menus and the controls with buttons only, especially when changing the position of my focusing square, consistently slowed me down. For operational speed and ease of use, the GH4 wins. A camera body is only as good as the lens on its mount. I bring this up because I consistently ran into this one major problem. At the time of this recording, there were not many great, very wide aperture, native autofocusing lenses for the Sony. The best lens I tested was the 55 1.8. It was amazing. As far as the 24-70 and the 70-200 f4, both solid lenses, I was just expecting a little bit more for their size, their weight, and their cost. I really wish they would have been at least 2.8. There are a handful of affordable third-party lenses, but nearly all of them require manual focusing. True, more native focusing Sony lenses are coming, but if you really like fast lenses that autofocus, with a Sony, your options are going to be limited. On the other hand, there are a huge selection of autofocusing micro four third lenses. Even Olympus lenses will autofocus on your GH4. Again, there are tons and tons of third-party manual focusing lenses, but if autofocusing lenses are one of your main concerns, you're going to have more choices with the GH4. There are plenty of different adapters out there that will allow you to use a huge variety of lenses on either system. Just know that in such a setup, most of them require manual focus. I personally like the photo diox on both systems. They're well made, they fit well, they have internal aperture blade sets that can be dialed in, but you're going to get some vignetting on the Sony with it. The cost was about $60 or $70, and I believe it's a quick, affordable way to get any existing lenses you might have onto either camera. There's a company called Metabones that makes some very high-end smart adapters for the Sony. It's supposed to retain autofocus. It just wasn't my experience with the version 3. It didn't really work for me, and at a cost of $400, I returned it because I was still having to manual focus. They have a new one, version 4, that's coming out soon. It's supposed to work much better, but at the time of this recording, it hasn't been released. Metabones also makes a speed booster, which concentrates light coming in from DSLR lenses, resulting in a 1 f-stop increase of light. Now they only have Nikon to Micro Four Thirds, there's no Canon yet. I tested the Canon to Sony, and I also eventually returned it because at $600 for an extra stop of light on the Sony that already has great low light performance, it just didn't make as much sense to me as it would have on the GH4. My advice here would be to rent an expensive adapter and test it before purchasing it. We're running out of light, so I have to give you my conclusions and recommendations depending on what kind of photographer you are. If you are looking for run and gun videography, if you have a need for internal 4K video, if you want an all-in-one solution, compact, light, easy to travel with, all the bells and whistles for a very affordable price, you are definitely going to want to get the GH4. I'm calling it the all-round winner for this shootout, and I think we are looking at the 2014 Camera of the Year. It is that good. In fact, during this epic shootout, I actually decided to get a second GH4 simply because we want to shoot in 4K. I was that impressed with it, and it was that useful. When I went shooting at the zoo, it was always the first camera I would grab. It was easy to set up. I love the touchscreen monitor. Very quick to get these run and gun type shots. Now, before you all run out and buy a GH4, there are a set of photographers I need to tell you right now. We're talking about the professional portrait photographers, professional wedding photographers, street photographers, landscape photographers, especially those of you who are doing astrophotography. I don't know of many housings available now for it, but if you're a scuba diver, it's going to be a phenomenal underwater camera for its focusing ability, for its ISO performance. You can bump it up. You can really max out and push the A7S for dynamic range. The S-Log feature is wonderful if you have, low light with highlight shooting conditions. The plethora of settings and profiles on there. It's really for a higher end video shooter who has more time to get set up. Those are all very niche specialty kinds of shootings. You're going to spend a little bit more, $2,500, $2,000 for the video recorder, the external video recorder when it comes out. So it's going to take a little bit more budget, deeper pockets. But I have also decided to buy a Sony A7S simply because there's nothing else like it. You're not going to find anything that can do what it does in terms of ISO noise performance. I would kind of rate it as a special forces type of camera. It's a specialist camera, and it is very good at what it does well. Weaknesses on the GH4 were the depth of field, very deep. Sometimes that's a good thing. And also the ISO performance, but I think we showed that we can correct that with a wider aperture lens. The cost on the A7S, it's sports shooting, and the lack of internal 4K recording were the three weaknesses that I saw on the Sony. But if you have a need to shoot in low light, it's going to be worth it, especially if you're producing a very high quality type of video product. I have to give a sincere thank you to each and every one of you. My videos have done very well since my epic shootouts. I want to say thank you for subscribing. Thank you for sharing the video. I know that because you guys have shared these and liked them, that this is what you guys want to see. And as long as you're doing that and you're continuing to share, and I continue to get subscribers, I'm going to continue to make these videos. I also have to give a very warm thank you to my friends over at B&H Photo for providing the HK recorder, which I use to get the 4K video off the Sony and the 10-bit 4K out of the GH4. Thank you to my friends who helped me. There's a lot of people who are involved in the creation of this video. We spent a lot of time and a lot of effort. We are really trying to produce excellent reviews, and video products on our YouTube channel. In any event, I want to say thank you guys again so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. If you found this video helpful, you may be interested in my crash course for the GH4 or the A7S. I'll teach you the basics and show you how to shoot like a pro in no time. You can order them from the following link.